I wanted to give a thanks to the religion department and to the Goodspeed Lecture. The Goodspeed brothers were Denison graduates in the 1890s, and then one went on to do biblical studies at the University of Chicago, and it was apparently a really important biblical studies scholar. The two of the brothers donated a pile of money at some point, and that has endowed this lecture for henceforward. And it allows those who study religion seriously in an academic way to come and give a lecture. And so I've used that a couple of times, and I'm lucky enough to have with me Andy Lewis tonight. So Andy, I've been fortunate enough to call my friend and co-author for several years now. He's 2011 PhD from American University. Before that, what was the degree you got before that?
I have a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in Christian ethics.
And he consorts with a heathen like me, so I've always appreciated that about Andy. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Andy. But he's written a pretty important book here that's just come out with Cambridge University Press. And I've been lucky enough to work on a few projects that are associated with this as he's been developing this book. And this is an argument that I find really persuasive and sort of important for us to at least grapple with. So he's going to review that and then take your questions. He'll speak for about 35-40 minutes and then take the questions that you have, and then we'll move on with our evenings. But thanks again for coming. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to be delivering the Goodspeed Lecture. Honor to be here at Denison. At the home of my good friend Paul Juke. I just thanks for hosting me. I wanted to begin with sort of something for you to think about. There's a story of an Orthodox religious person. He was a business owner, and he owned a shop. And then the shop, he wanted to sell goods to people. And I didn't turn my mic on.
No, I didn't.
This is going to tell the story even better if you have a mic on. That's how this works. So this Orthodox religious person, he had a shop in a city, and it was a small shop, and he just wanted to do his business the way he wanted to do it, right? And he wanted to sell his goods and services how he wanted to do it. And then the government comes in and says, listen, you can't provide these goods in this certain way, okay? You can't provide these goods the way you want to do it. And he says, whoa, 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 the goods I want to provide, I want to do it in the way that matches with my religious beliefs. Okay, does that sound like anything that's going on today? Well, it might sound a bit like somebody who wants to bake a cake, right? But this particular story that I'm thinking of happened in 1960 in Philadelphia. And this person in 1960 in Philadelphia was an Orthodox Jewish business owner. And this Orthodox Jewish business owner in Philadelphia he owned a shop that sold clothes and home goods. And what was going on with this Orthodox Jewish home goods salesperson is that, well, in Pennsylvania they had a law where businesses were closed on Sundays. Okay? Well, what did that mean for this Orthodox Jewish person? Well, he didn't open his business on Saturdays. Well, this was bad for business when you, for religious reasons, weren't open on Saturdays. And then the state, the government, said you couldn't operate your business on Sundays. Okay? And so the two busiest shopping days of the week, you had to be closed. Does that make sense? Okay? And so he said, listen, I think that the government should provide me an accommodation to this government regulation based on my religious beliefs. And so we took this case to the court system and said, I've got a First Amendment right to practice my religion, I should have an exception to this religious rule. Now, it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said, sorry, you lose. Okay? Now, that case sounds a good bit like the case of this guy today. Okay? In 5 weeks, December 5th, we're going to hear the case. This got a little blurry here. He's not as blurry in real life. This guy, Jack Phillips. Now, there's some slight differences, but Jack Phillips is a Christian bakery owner. This guy called Masterpiece Cakeshop out of Colorado. And he was approached to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding, and he said, I'm happy to provide baked goods for you for a whole variety of things, but I don't do cakes for same-sex weddings. I don't do it. In fact, they've narrowed what he says he's going to offer. I don't do personalized cakes for same-sex weddings. Now, conservative Christians would have lauded perhaps the ruling against the Jewish shop owner in 1960, saying, yeah, we support the closing of businesses on Sundays, the Sabbath day of rest on Sundays in 1960. And today, they're fighting tooth and nail for the religious freedom protection for small business owners. And I think it shows, in some sense, what's going on here. We have a big major shift in how particularly religious groups or conservative Christian religious groups are looking at rights. That rights have become much more personal and become much more important. Okay? And so this just sort of epitomizes what we have going on here, is this idea of what I call a sort of rights turn or a rights shift in conservative Christian politics. And this is sort of a monumental shift. And what I term sort of a refashioning of our typical culture war politics. So when we think of sort of old world culture, old world, that's a bad term, but when we think of sort of previous generation culture war politics, we think of sort of morals, how we're going to control sort of sexuality, we're going to think of gender discussions, right? And we often think about morals and competing visions of freedom and liberty, but often is sort of the moralizing and biblical morality of conservative Christianity on one side, right? And individual liberty on the other. Well, what is going on in this refashioning of this new culture war are often two competing rights. The rights claimed by a conservative religious group, and the rights claimed by those that are on the left. Okay? And they compete in the public sphere. And this is sort of this refashioning, this changing dynamic. And so this is sort of what my book's about, and the book is about sort of how we've gotten here, what's gone on, what are the competing dynamics, and where are we going, all right? So that's a bit of where we're at. And so how did this change occur? Where do we see it? And perhaps where are we going? So I call this sort of the right's turn in conservative Christian politics, and my sort of subtitle really gives away what I think are the central mechanisms, like how abortion, sort of the politics of abortion, the key, the primary culture war issue, changed or transformed the culture war politics of the old era into this new era. Okay, so this is sort of where I'm going. So, what taught evangelicals or conservative Christians about the politics of rights? What moved them in this new direction? This is this big question. Okay? Now, let's just stop and pause for a minute. If you know much about the scope of rights and culture and politics, you'll know that the 20th century and rights, that this is the domain of the left. Okay? Now, rights politics, I mean, there's a theme and there's a strain of rights politics that goes throughout American history, and It is part of who we are as Americans, part of our identity, part of our culture, part of the way we talk about things. But this is really the politics of the left in the 20th century, right? I mean, when we think of free speech politics, it's those who are more liberal. They're anti-war protesters. They are people who are for more sort of liberal things like pornography or even sort of more sexualized art that are pushing free speech law. They're for civil rights protesters, gender equality activists, right? These are the people who are pushing things on the left. People who are pushing things like expanded rights for and civil liberties for the accused, right? This is how we're pushing civil rights and civil liberties in the middle of the 20th century. And who's often opposing those? You know, evangelicals, conservatives, Republicans, people who we might categorize as civic Republicans, right? Communitarians. And so when I talk about the fact that this group has shifted toward a frame of rights, like this is a major move, okay? This is something that should not just be taken lightly. Like this, the last vestige of sort of civic republicanism, perhaps, are evangelical Christians, and they are moving toward the politics of rights, okay? They are moving towards the politics of liberalism. And so if you want to know sort of what's going on in the big picture of political theory, and they're moving in this direction, this is a big, major move for us, all right? So we shouldn't sort of discount that as a major theme and a major change in our politics. At the same time, I want us to know that like the story of rights sort of is an American story. It's a story that it's part of our creed. It's part of who we are, and so it's something that we all grasp onto. So when we use the language of rights, it has resonance, and so I think that it matters for politics. Okay, so even though that this has been the primary story of the left, that it is something that it can be wielded well on both sides, that it matters to both sides, and so that this is not, it wouldn't be unusual for rights to be successful, a successful part of both sides of our political culture. And so these strains are within our politics. They're not outside of our reach, outside of our domain, and in fact, rights are accessible forms of political discourse, okay? And so we should see that as sort of a useful part of our discussion. And so, in fact, I think this is what public advocates are seeing, is that the public, in some way, they can sort of attach onto issues when they're discussed in the realm of rights. And so this is how I think advocates see it. And when they frame issues in the language of rights, then the people understand them better. And so since rights are part of our discourse, that can be really useful. So this is sort of what I think is going on. So here's my big question. What taught evangelicals about rights? What's the process? Well, for me, there's sort of a multifaceted process. In part, it's about how evangelicals went from being a dominant part of the political culture, and they have moved to shifting to be much more of a minority cultural position, right? So as their cultural dynamic has changed, as their allies in that political culture have been reduced, so as white Christians have come to take up less a part of the political landscape, then evangelicals, as their numbers have also been reduced, but then their allies are less, then their cultural dynamic has decreased, right? And so they have less cultural influence, right? So that matters. So they move from more of a majority position to a minority position, so rights tend to matter more when you're in a minority position. And so that matters, but then what particular issue matters? And I attach a lot of attention to this particular issue, one of the most conspicuous ones, and it is, for me, the politics of abortion. Okay? And there are a whole variety of issues, of reasons for this, but I'll give you a couple brief ones. One is the politics of abortion first. It was one of the first issues to move evangelicals into this minority standing. When evangelicals and conservative Christians, when Roe versus Wade catapulted them into sort of the losing position in the decade that followed, learned to act on the defensive, okay? And so when you're acting in a defensive posture, you learn to think and respond in defensive mechanisms. And so this activates this sort of rights-based politics, and so that's part of it. Another part of it is that there was a rights-based stream in abortion politics that preceded evangelicals' involvement in it. So prior to Roe versus Wade, in the middle of the 20th century, there was a human rights element to the politics of abortion. A lot of this was connected to the Catholic pro-life movement, which developed in the 40s and 50s. And the Catholics took that and they combined it with some liberal Protestants, and a lot of this was based out of the UN Declaration of Rights and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and they grounded this sort of human rights understanding of the value of human life. And so there was this universal right to life and human rights element to the pro-life movement that was very early on. You can see it in the naming of the National Right to Life Committee, the National Right to Life organizations that were founded very early in the middle of the 1960s. And so this human rights, right to life element of the anti-abortion movement carried with it this rights tradition. Now, this rights tradition wasn't the only tradition in the anti-abortion movement. There was also with it a morality tradition. And that morality tradition held a lot of sway in evangelicalism, but by the middle of the 1980s and early part of the 1990s, the human rights one really started to take over as a big part of the public argument. And so this human rights tradition started to matter a lot. And so the politics of abortion and the human rights tradition started to teach the value of a rights-based argument, particularly the rights-based public arguments. Related to that, and we'll talk about it when I get into things like free speech, but actually the actual process of advocating on abortion and taking abortion politics to the streets started to activate thinking about how do you protect and defend your rights. And so this started this sort of rights-based thinking and processing and those kind of things. That is sort of the outward-looking rights framing stuff. Related to that, then, the other function of the politics of abortion is that the politics of abortion are very sort of stable internally. And because the shift in rights, particularly for evangelicals, is such a big culture shift. Like you're trying to shift a group who was conservative, moralistic culture, civic Republican, to being much more sort of liberalizing individual rights. Does that make sense? That you need something to attach such a culture shift to. And abortion becomes the vehicle to do that, okay? So this is what, a 35-year chart of the General Social Survey of what evangelicals' political attitudes look like on abortion. You can see that they're pretty stable, and in fact, they become more pro-life over time. The issue for evangelicals remains stable, it remains important, it remains highly salient, and in fact, abortion becomes, for many of them, more important than party ID. For many of them, it drove them to change their party identification. Okay, and so this issue is like centrally important. It is something that was it becomes an easy issue for them. It's an issue to which it was part of their worldview, it's part of their identity, and it's something to which they could easily attach other issues to. And so when advocates are out there saying, we need to liberalize our advocacy on free speech, we need to take new positions on free speech law, or we need to have directions on health care that you might not agree with, right? Well, let's link it to abortion politics. Let's make that tie. And then it becomes less controversial. okay? We're representing that issue and tying it to something that we think that matters to the base so much that then we decrease how controversial it is, okay? So that's sort of the idea that linking the issue to the pro-life movement allows for sort of this advocacy change. It's sort of this powerful, easy issue that makes it ripe for sort of conflict expansion, okay? So this is sort of what I see is going on with the abortion issue, okay? So you have this shift toward rights, and then you have this shift, or this ability to connect it to the mass, to the base, okay? And an example of the shift toward rights in evangelicalism, so I give a lot of attention to the Southern Baptist Convention. They're the largest non-Catholic evangelical denomination in the country. In 1980, for example, they passed their first big resolution criticizing taking a firm stance against abortion. And what do they do in that? They sort of criticize mothers who get abortions, right? So they take this sort of moral approach that having abortions is immoral, right? And then by 1996, they passed another big resolution, and then they say, like, abortion, it's important to protect the life of the unborn, right? By 2012, they're saying it's really important to defend the right to life of the unborn and promote human flourishing. Like, they go from morals and right and wrong to justice and rights and human flourishing in the way they talk about abortion in this 20-year span. And so the way they reframe the issue is really important here, I think. And this is sort of how the sort of rights importance of the pro-life movement sort of change over time, okay? So I just want to give you a sense of that. So I'll briefly cover 3 issues: free speech, healthcare politics, gay marriage, and show you how those have played out a bit in the politics of rights. Free speech is sort of how a growing individual right developed. Healthcare, how a competing right developed. And in gay marriage, how an emerging right has developed. And we'll conclude with some finishing thoughts. So just briefly, and then we'll leave some time for some questions. Free speech is sort of the big one. And I look at 3 areas. The first area is direct areas of free speech protest. So before evangelicals start advocating on free speech related to abortion, so pre-1980s, all of their free speech advocacy is pretty much limiting free speech, okay? Particularly radical speech. They don't like a lot of free speech, but they don't do a lot of free speech advocacy, okay? What happens? Anti-abortion protesters start taking to the streets to protest abortion. Some of it gets sort of radical, like blocking clinics and things, but lawsuits develop, okay? What happens? Well, pro-life groups, evangelicals, Catholics, they start developing legal organizations and crafting arguments to defend themselves. In the middle of it, they start learning the value of free speech and free speech politics, okay? And so the politics of abortion start teaching them about how to operate in the free speech zones. And a whole bunch of it is about how you handle abortion clinics, okay? But in the process, they start engaging in a liberalizing understanding of free speech law and free speech process. A lot of this happens in the 1990s. There are a whole slew of cases, and there's some pushback against the free access to clinic entrances legislation, which was passed by the Clinton administration. But and there's some victories and some defeats for these pro-life groups, but there's a lot of this stuff going on, and a whole bunch of new legal groups that crop up, and they start really pushing on the free speech issue pretty hard, okay? And a lot of it is direct free speech, direct advocacy. This is a case out of 2014 out of Boston, Massachusetts. And this is sort of the high water mark of the whole thing. This is a lady, and her name is, sorry. I have the note right here, but I can't see it. It's, no, it's Coakley. Or it's McCullough, it's, sorry. Oh, there it is. It's Eleanor McCullen, and she's out of Boston, and she's a Catholic pro-life demonstrator. Oh, I went way full screen, my fault. And the Supreme Court had initiated this line, or initiated legislation which would require that they had these lines about how far you should be away from abortion clinics. And some pro-life groups were objecting to this line, that it violated free speech principles. And one of these conservative Christian groups took up her case, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and they pushed her case to the Supreme Court. And alongside, a bunch of evangelical groups filed with her. Well, when they filed their brief, they started citing some of the most liberal free speech laws we have on our books. In fact, I mean, you have some of the most conservative religious denominations and bodies in the country citing things like New York Times versus Sullivan, which is like one of the epitome, like one of the peak liberal free speech and free press laws, and like citing this approvingly. But even more, they discuss speech and having sort of an emotive content, which comes out of Cohen versus California, which is an anti-war protester who wrote sort of F the draft on his jacket, and talks about how, that this is sort of this lyric of speech, that this is of such great value that we should protect it, and this is the kind of speech that they're willing to defend. Does that make sense? And so they are going to bat for this abortion protester in ways that they would have hated that decision in 1972. Do you understand? Like, they're using this weapon of a decision in 1972 that they hated and saying, like, this is how much this matters. Okay? Evangelicals, and then they don't even say this word, right? And they win this case. It's a really big deal. And you might say, okay, well, they're just pulling out all the stops to defend these abortion protests. Maybe true. But what then happens is they start taking these same principles and defending free speech in other contexts. Okay? So this is a case out of Alaska. You may have seen this grainy footage. The torch runs by. I don't know how they get the torch to Alaska. It's a long run. But this student rolls out this banner about bong hits for Jesus. Jesus is cool with this, I guess. Anyway, they roll this out, right? Well, the student gets expelled because it's like some sort of student-sanctioned field trip where you go across the street and watch the torch run. And then the student sues the school because he says he's off school property. And a bunch of religious groups start to back the student. And you're like, what? This is weird. It's like drug use and Jesus, and why are the religious groups involved? And they're like, if you can't say this at school, you might not be able to say all kinds of other stuff, so we should defend this person. Well, it sounds a bit like extending the rights for others because it might be good for me, and that's what they argue. It's like, who knows when we might need this kind of protection for ourselves? Does that make sense? All right? And the exact same sort of arguments start to happen in public, okay, in public opinion. So this is public opinion data. And the General Social Survey for the last 40 years ask the public the same kind of thing. Would you allow groups you don't like, generally like communists and atheists and militarists and all kinds of other kind of groups, you don't even talk about militarists anymore, but right, groups you don't like, would you allow them to speak in public and have a book in the library and teach in public schools and like a whole bunch of free speech activities? So I compile this into an index. And you can see that general public is sort of, they get slightly more favorable to free speech over time. Well, look at these evangelicals. They get like much more favorable to free speech over time for these sort of radical kind of groups, right? These outsider groups. And so over the course of the years, they're much more favorable to free speech. And so certainly they had a long way to go. Let me look at the gap, right? There's a pretty big gap here. But they largely have closed the gap in the 40-year period. So lots of learning. And this isn't about protecting our own rights, but this is about other people's rights. And so I run this into a model, just show off a little data wizardry, right? And I segment it into time periods. And so this is sort of 3 separate time periods. So the early, sort of the pre-Christian right period, the early one where you get more moralizing, and then the latter period. And the most important thing I wanted to show you is sort of this is the abortion one. So if you're evangelical and you have pro-life views, and you can just see that we start to get movement over time. So it goes that used to be that if you're a more pro-life evangelical, you were less supportive of free speech, and in the current period, you're more supportive of free speech. Okay? And so we get a movement over time in these period effects. So the other thing that really matters a lot about abortion politics and free speech is campaign finance. Now, you may have heard that campaign finance reform has been totally halted by free speech arguments. What you probably haven't heard is that pro-life groups are behind it. It's groups like National Right to Life and the Susan B. Anthony list who really have pushed a whole bunch of anti-campaign finance laws. In fact, one of the very first campaign finance cases, 1998, Wisconsin Right to Life versus the Federal Election Commission. Wisconsin was a branch of the National Right to Life group, Wisconsin Right to Life. The main lawyer in the big campaign finance case was a staff lawyer, James Bopp, from National Right to Life. Got big Right to Life awards and things like this. And so there are all these interconnections. When you get groups, the Southern Baptists, for example, they come out early and big against campaign finance reform. And why do they do it? They say, we think that we should protect free speech, and we think that if we have campaign finance laws on the books, that it will restrict the rights to advocate on things like abortion. And so there was a lot of early activity against campaign finance reform in the name of, in the terms of abortion and abortion politics. Okay? And so what's fascinating is the data says that most evangelicals were for campaign finance reform, though there was a lot of sort of non-opinion. Okay? This is an issue that people don't know that much about. And so what's interesting is that because these groups, because of the abortion link, the elites, I think, had a lot more leverage to sort of go against what was sort of a squishy opinion of the masses. Does that make sense? And so if they could tie it to abortion, then they could say, listen, we want to make sure that Susan B. Anthony list and National Right to Life have the ability to lobby on these issues. We want to watch out for campaign finance reform. Okay? And so broad free speech rights on campaign issues have been a key issue. Okay, these sort of unfettered free speech laws. Cool. So the other thing I'll quickly talk to you about or I would quickly tell you about is sort of healthcare laws. The reality is, this is just a brief data point. There's almost no difference between evangelicals and non-evangelicals on their view about healthcare over a 40-year period. Evangelicals are on the top. This is opposition. You can see they're slightly more opposed to healthcare. So the question is, why are evangelicals so opposed to healthcare when we actually try to get healthcare reform? Right? They were really opposed to the Clinton health initiatives, super opposed to the Obama ones, right? Well, certainly it's because they're Republicans. The Republicans are opposed to those. And part of the real reason, I think, is because following Roe versus Wade, healthcare questions get tied to abortion questions. Who's going to fund them? And these initiatives have been linked together. And a lot of the advocacy efforts have been stalled by abortion questions. Okay? So there's been a lot of linkage there. And then you can ask more questions about this if you want, but I'll just go to show you, when you look at the appeals to the Obama healthcare initiatives, the legislative appeal, or the Supreme Court appeals, there were three big cases. NFIB versus Sebelius, King versus Burwell, and then the last one, the Hobby Lobby case. You get almost no conservative Christian groups lobby in either of the first two cases, King versus Burwell or NFIB versus Sebelius. Both of the first two were really going after sort of the constitutionality of the healthcare law in general, in large part because they didn't have a strong abortion link. But they really went after the Hobby Lobby question, the contraceptive mandate. Okay, so in the Hobby Lobby case, you get just dozens of groups. And what's really important about that case, I think, is that it took the fact that HHS was going to cover what evangelicals called abortion-inducing drugs, the few of those, what they often deemed abortifacient drugs, to get evangelicals even initiated into it. At the very beginning, Catholics were concerned about contraceptives, and there were some evangelicals talking about religious freedom, kind of for Catholics. But really, when they started reframing it that there are a couple of these drugs that might cause abortions, then you got a bunch of evangelicals really concerned. In fact, Hobby Lobby was really only concerned about a couple of the contraceptive provisions, the ones that might cause abortion. So really, it was this direct abortion link, and when all the evangelical groups really hammered in on this abortion-causing drug issue all the time. And so when they framed it that way. Okay, so we can talk more about healthcare later, but just want to give you that sense. Like, there's an absence of lobbying until you get this link. All right? Much of what is at play here is things like the Hyde Amendment and the funding for healthcare and those kind of questions. The last thing is sort of where we're going. And I mean, the big question is what's going on with same-sex marriage, right? There was no credible alternative right for same-sex marriage for evangelicals, and part of that, I think, is why public opinion crashed so quickly, that there was no credible defense. So in the politics of abortion, there was a credible counter-rights argument, the right to life, the rights of the unborn, and so we've had this sort of stalemate of public opinion for the last 40 years. There was no credible conservative rights alternative. And so public opinion quickly shifted for same-sex marriage. And so the question is, does that defeat my argument? And I think no. I think what really is happening is now the right is learning what's the argument. And they're retreating to some sort of rights bunker. And the real rights bunker they have is religious freedom. They've trotted out a few other rights arguments, like the right to a mom and dad and some other things like that. But really, this religious freedom is sort of the rights bunker that they have, and this is where they're at, right? And these are the conflicts. The right of this sort of a sect, of a group, to sort of live in its own pluralistic environment, make its own decisions, and that's sort of what's going on. You even see in the data that evangelicals are becoming more accepting of same-sex marriage, and, but at the same time, they're becoming more accepting of same-sex relations, but not at the same rate. So it used to be that evangelicals had about the same sort of view of same-sex relations and same-sex marriage, but now they are more favorable to same-sex marriage than they are same-sex relations. So they're sort of privatizing in some of what their view of same-sex things. And so saying like, well, I might think it's immoral, but I'm not going to place that on you. Does that make sense? And so there's sort of this differing thing. And then they say, just give me the religious freedom to act how I want in private, right? And I won't sort of force your beliefs upon you. That's sort of where I think some of this is going. So, last big question. All this rights talk, all this rights stuff, they have all these rights discussions, these rights claiming. They've learned a bit about rights. What does that mean for our politics? What does that mean for other people's rights? Well, the big question is there any rights extending rights for others? Well, I showed you a good bit that there was some rights learning about others and free speech, that they learned about other people's free speech rights. In the same way, it seems that they've learned about the rights of all kinds of other people's, of other people's that they may not have liked. So this is, for example, a chart of tolerance, the political rights of gays and lesbians. The same data set, the General Social Survey. And you can see, like, tolerance of homosexuals almost doubles in a, what is this, a 40-year period. Okay, now, we may not think it's perfect where it is now, but a doubling in a 40-year period is quite surprising. Particularly if you think about what some of the public statements were from evangelicals and congressmen and Catholics when Congress was passing the Defense of Marriage Act, for example, in 1996, okay, which wasn't that long ago, or when a bunch of these state-level bans on same-sex marriage were going on. Okay, so we have a lot of rights extending going on there, sort of the public rights of homosexuals. It's sort of the rights of atheists. You can see that the evangelicals on the bottom, the tolerance for atheists have gone up. We see evangelicals having some increased advocacy for Muslim groups. Now, this is not perfect. The last election taught us, like, there's a lot of negative attitudes toward Muslims going on. But you did see a bunch of Christian legal groups come to the defense of, like, a Muslim prisoner who wanted to grow his beard longer and advocating for religious freedom. So coming alongside of this prisoner, we've seen some religious freedom groups try to help mosques get built. And some of those groups were Christians. Now, there's been some pushback on those religious freedom groups, and some advocates have tried to stand firm, and some have backed away. And so it's a bit of 1 or 1.5 steps forward and 1 step backward, okay? And so I call this a bit of sort of episodic rights learning, right? So sometimes there's increased tolerance and increased improvement, and sometimes there's steps backward. But when you zoom out, there seems to be improvement over sort of the life course, generational courses. The good doctor here, Dr. Jupe and I, we ran a survey experiment a couple years ago. And we asked some people, a whole grand sample of people, we primed them with some statements of some politicians and some clergy members. And we asked them, we said, we told them that their rights were under threat. And particularly, we talked about how either their political rights or their religious freedom rights were under threat. And we used either a clergy person or a politician to make the statement. And then we asked them about groups they don't like. We said, which group do you like the least? We gave them a handful of groups that people might not like. and we asked about their political tolerance of these groups. And what we find, and this panel is really what we're going to look at here on the right, is that for evangelicals, if they were given, particularly from the clergy, this dark black line, if they were given these religious liberty frames, and even to some extent the free speech frames, about their own rights, that we need to protect ourselves, that we were more likely to extend tolerance to others, even people we don't like. So we start thinking about our own rights, we're more likely to pass those along to others. And we think that's really valuable. And this is certainly a process, okay? And this is sort of a controlled, single-shot, small environment. But it seems to be shown out over sort of the 40-year period, that you start thinking about your own rights, you're willing to also consider the process of other people's. And so we tried to show it that way. So where do we go from here? Certainly we have expansive rights claiming, and this expansive rights claiming is sort of it's transformed our culture. I think it's transformed the way we have public discussions. It's transformed the way that the most prominent, the most important public battles are going to be fought. And they're going to be fought over my rights versus your rights. That might be problematic in some sense. Like, it might be it might be difficult for us to compromise. We might feel like in some ways like our rights aren't being fully appreciated. But I think we've proven the fact that rights are an accessible form for us to have political discourse. And that in many ways, it's not an either or, that we can both have like a robust political culture and we can have a respect for other people's rights. And if groups like this can learn it and extend it, I think there's actually some important hope for how politics might work this way. So hopefully that's a lot to chew on, or maybe just a little. It's almost past my bedtime, but I would love to hear more about it. And thanks for listening and having me. So.